This video is part 3 of Chapter 5, Survey Research for PSY 222, Research Methods in the Psychological Sciences. Where we left off the last time, I talked a little bit about some of the steps involved in developing questionnaires. Your authors also give you some guidelines for writing survey questions. And do remember that I said a couple of times in the previous part of the lecture that writing questionnaires and developing scales is both art and science. Your data is only as good as the questions that you ask, and that means that it's very important that you put in the time to think hard about how you develop questions. When you choose participants, so one of the first things that you need to keep in mind when you're writing questions for a questionnaire is who is going to be responding to the questions and how do you want them to respond. So a broad category of decisions you have to make is, are you going to give people the free choice of how to respond, such as writing out their answers, or are you going to give them closed options? So in one of your Pallant homeworks, there was a question about which of the two ways of reporting age would be preferable. You could ask and just give a comment box, tell me your age in years, and the person would write in or type in their age in years. Or you could give them ranges, such as 18 to 20, 21 to, and so on. That's a difference between free response, open-ended, or closed-ended, where the response options are provided for the participant. A different kind of decision that you make is what kind of language you're choosing to use. Now, if I was writing a questionnaire for a professional audience and I understood the jargon that they typically use, I could use that jargon and vocabulary that's consistent with that particular population. If, however, I'm dealing with an audience that I'm unsure, what's their level of education, generally speaking, and so on, what I'm going to want to aim for is simple, straightforward vocabulary that the average person would be comfortable with. So you want to avoid jargony, unfamiliar terminology. I once had an advisor in graduate school who said, when you write survey questions, you aim for, and he would say, an 8th grade education, which I always thought was a little bit insulting, but his point was that you need to imagine in your population, aim for language that everyone is likely to easily understand and not be confused by. Because the last thing that you want is for people to kind of consistently be confused by the questions that you write. Not only does it encourage people to stop participating, but it also makes it unclear what they're responding to. You also want to be specific when you ask questions. Your authors note, avoid double-barreled questions. What that refers to is if you have a sentence that represents a question, but embedded in that sentence are actually two questions for the participant to think about, and then they have only one choice of answers. And when you do that, you're never going to be sure which question are they responding to, or are they responding to both. And as a result, as a researcher, you can't really interpret any findings coming from a double-barreled question. You want to help your reader out by using conditional phrases, by avoiding leading questions. Leading questions are questions which suggest what kind of answer you want as the researcher. You also want to avoid so-called loaded questions, which tend to be very values heavy and contain kind of embedded within them a lot of value judgments. So you want to avoid leading questions which might encourage your participant to respond in a particular way that they don't necessarily feel. And you don't want to use really heavily value-laden questions that are loaded and may cause reactivity in your participants. And you also want to kind of vary the wording of your questions so that you don't get your questionnaire taker to kind of slide into what we call response bias. Let's say that you're assessing attitudes towards, off the top of my head, gun control, but you write all of your questions such that selecting strongly agree would mean that the person is strongly in favor of gun rights. So if you write all the questions in that way, people will get into a response set and their responses may be biased even more strongly in the direction of their overriding opinion. So what you have to do is stagger the wording of your questions such that you have an equal number roughly of items that are positively worded versus negatively worded so that you get more balanced responding, and the participant has to really pay attention to each individual question that they're answering. Your authors give you some examples of these types of problems that you want to avoid. So for double-barreled questions, they give you the example of, have you suffered headaches and nausea in the past week? If a person answers yes to that, you don't know whether they've had both or one or the other because the wording is unclear. So you would need to separate it out and write two separate questions. A leading question example would be, most people favor the use of solar energy. What do you think? Well, you're leading the person and also encouraging them to kind of fall into the trap of following the leader. So if most people believe it, what do you think? You might soften your negative attitude or move your attitude more toward that mythological most people. Loaded questions, as I said, tend to be value-laden or emotion-laden. Here's an example. Do you agree with the racist propaganda issued by your state senator? It not only leads, but it also makes a value judgment about said senator. That kind of questioning, those loaded terms, can cause reactivity. If you like your state senator and you don't think he's racist, then you're going to be reactive and really disagree with that statement. If, however, you hate the state senator, you're going to so totally agree with it. Regardless, it's not an unbiased question, and those kinds of questions should be avoided. As a writer, you also have to think about how you order your questions. Again, we don't want our respondents to kind of get into a mode of responding that leaves them inattentive. We also don't want responding to one part of a questionnaire to influence the way people respond to the rest of the questionnaire. In self-administered questionnaires, what's often recommended is that you put interesting questions early in the questionnaire. Now, personally, when I write questionnaires, I try to make it so that the whole questionnaire will hold the interest of the respondent. That's not always possible, but I try to do that because I don't want them to feel disengaged. I don't want them to drop out. But there is this general recommendation that if you want to get people's attention and get them invested in your research, then you should try to give them some interesting questions to respond to early in case some other parts of the questionnaire are more mundane. In interviews or other kinds of either face-to-face or online or telephone type interviews, typically demographic questions are asked first, and I do this even in online questionnaires that are self-administered. We typically will get demographics before we collect other data. There are some occasions where you want to put demographics late. For example, if you are concerned that if one of the demographic variables is one of your independent variables, and you don't really want your respondent thinking about that possibility, the demographics that they provide would be used to make group comparisons, you may put the demographics later or intersperse them with other items. But as a general recommendation, when you're doing interviews, both in person or on video or by telephone, demographics are typically asked first. Sometimes you might want to do branching and funneling and filtering questions when you need to. For example, if you have a questionnaire where there's a screener question, and if you answer yes, you're going to answer this set of questions. If you answer no, you answer this set of questions, and so on. There are a number of elaborate questionnaire designs that may have that kind of filtering and funneling on certain occasions. You can ask a legitimate question, and as a social psychologist, I ask this question all the time. It's a major topic within social psychology of how well can you predict actual behavior using self-reported information, such as attitudes or statements of intention. It's a fact, it's a well-known fact that human beings don't always do what they say. And we can only count on the correspondence between attitudes and actions for as long as we are capable of accurately doing assessment of both things. So survey responses, when we're putting that issue of correspondence into the context of survey research, we do have to acknowledge that there are times when either accidentally or intentionally people are not truthful when they provide survey responses. People may filter how they respond due to what's called social desirability bias. So they may want to present themselves in a way that they believe looks more positive or that feels more positive to them. In other cases, people are just simply misremembering, or they don't have access to the actual information. Human beings are notoriously poor at estimating how long it's been since something happened, or how often something happened. Even when it's information you would think you would know, we often are incorrect about those sorts of things. We also have to be real concerned about possible reactivity when we ask questions, and that can influence the correspondence between actual behavior and self-reported information. So reactivity is when, how you've worded the question or the simple act of asking questions may cause people to respond in a way that is sometimes more extreme, sometimes less extreme than what they would have responded otherwise. And therefore, you lose some predictive ability in terms of connecting up with and being able to predict actual behavior. So, for example, with both reactivity and social desirability effects, if you want to know who people are going to vote for, and then their actual voting, if you ask people their opinions on various issues, and what you hope is you can take their opinion on these issues and then predict who they're going to vote for. And then you look at their actual voting, or you ask them, who did you actually vote for? Sometimes, researchers are surprised by a lack of connection between, their people's stated attitudes and then their actual voting choices. Some of what's going on sometimes is reactivity based on how questions are worded or how they're presented. And other issues are, how people want to be seen. They may want to be seen in a particular way, so social desirability is driving how they're responding to a self-report instrument. And then when they get the actual chance to vote, they're voting in a more just natural, organic situation, outside of the boundaries of social desirability. Sometimes knowing that you have the possibility that people won't be truthful, knowing that there's a possibility of reactivity and social desirability effects, you're faced with kind of a dilemma as a questionnaire researcher. Your goal is kind of to accept people's responses at face value unless you have a good reason to think that there's a problem. There are some notorious examples in electoral research, in political science, where you had people being interviewed or polled and asked questions about their voting intentions, but then the results of the election were inconsistent with the numbers that were found in the polling. And those kinds of inconsistencies just, are real head scratchers for scientists. So you have to really think hard about what happened in terms of when that data was collected, why were people not giving you the information that then turned into their later voting behavior. But still, if we've done our due diligence in creating a questionnaire that's clear and valid and reliable, and we've provided people with a situation that doesn't produce very much reactivity, doesn't encourage social desirability effects. So for example, we've guaranteed anonymity and confidentiality in people's responding. That tends to reduce social desirability effects. If we've given people clear options and enough information so that they can be more accurate, if we've done our due diligence in that way, then we should be able to accept people's responses as truthful unless we have a good reason to think that in the outcomes that we're seeing that responses were intentionally flawed. How do you combat the things you can't control? There are always going to be some social desirability effects, there are always going to be some reactivity effects, and there are going to be some people who misrepresent themselves. So how do you go about, balancing that out? Well, one approach is to take a multi-method approach. So, you can take the same research question in one branch of the research program, collect anonymous online data. In another branch of the project, you collect face-to-face interview data. In another branch of the project, you might do systematic sampling and analysis across time. That multi-method approach, if you're starting to see the same patterns regardless of the methodology, that adds strength to your argument, supporting your conclusions. So we've arrived at the point where we have to ask that question, that, what's the connection between correlation and cause? And you should be familiar, if you've had an intro course in psych, correlation does not equal causation. It doesn't, it can't. So we need to remind ourselves, since most survey research is going to be interpreted in terms of correlational hypotheses, we have to remind ourselves what we can and cannot say when we interpret such data. The basic rule is, number one, correlation does not suggest that there is a causal relationship. You haven't done an experiment where you are systematically manipulating independent variables and systematically measuring dependent variables. In a lot of survey research, we're collecting data from samples of people, and we're going to see what variables predict what other variables and how well. That doesn't allow you to say that any one of those variables is causally connected to another. In order to state that, you have to conduct an actual experiment. There are potential relationships, and here's why you can't make causal conclusions. Let's say that you, from your survey data, you find that variable A is actually correlated with variable B. Let's say, for example, education level is correlated with earnings potential. It could be that you have, the more education people get, the better the jobs are going to be that they have and they earn more. So possibly how much education you get could causally impact your earning potential. However, in this case, it's not necessarily that B causes A, where you have earning potential causing education to go up, but if you look at it generationally, if your family already has high earning potential, you have access to a better education. So it in fact could be that the earning within your family is shaping your educational opportunities. You could also have a third variable. Another variable in between those two things is where you live. So the place you live, if it offers better educational options, it probably also offers you better employment options. So it may be an additional variable that's influencing both factors. And one really complicated statistical procedure that can help you to get closer to causal interpretations while still using correlated data is something called path analysis. And you're never, as an undergraduate, unless you're in somebody's lab and it happens to be a technique that they use, you're never going to have to do path analysis as an undergraduate. I'm not going to ask you to do it. I myself have only done it once, and it's tedious. It can be difficult, but it pays off. If you're a researcher using lots of correlational data and you want to get a handle on a system of variables and how they might be interacting with one another in terms of producing a particular outcome, path analysis is a procedure that can help you do that. Essentially what path analysis does, because you think of path as what's the pathway and what kind of stops am I making along the way to get to a particular causal outcome. So typically you have a variable that you want to predict, and you know that it's complexly related to several other variables that are themselves related to each other in complicated ways. You need a way to navigate that path, and path analysis is what does that. So it helps you to look at the individual relationships among variables. So here's a graphic I pulled off of Google Images. You might have a relationship between how much your income is and how anxious you are at the present moment. So as income goes up, anxiety goes down. As anxiety goes up, attention-seeking behavior goes down, and vice versa. As attention-seeking behavior goes up, anxiety goes down. That's a negative correlation. And then as income goes up, how much jewelry you have goes up. As attention-seeking goes up, how much jewelry you have goes up. So you have this really kind of complicated connection between these variables. And this is kind of a silly way of demonstrating it, but and many path analyses, like if you went to Google now and pulled up Google Images and typed in path analysis, some of the pictures that pop up are these ridiculously crazy complicated images of 20 or 30 variables that all have intercorrelations with each other, and you're trying to figure out a model that best predicts some outcome variables. So these analyses can be very, very complex, but very helpful in helping to tease apart the predictive pathways and the interactions between variables. So you still can't make definitive causal statements based on path analytic data, but what you can do is get a better handle on the interactions between variables as they relate to a final outcome that you're interested in. There still may be other variables that are untested, that aren't in your analysis, that could be important. So as a result, you can't make any kind of conclusive causal statements. What you have is a more powerful correlational model, though, that in some ways represents a closer step to causal interpretation. In path analysis, there is discussion of what are called mediator variables and moderator variables. Mediators are variables that help you to understand the connection between two other variables. So you might have some intervening factor that helps you to understand the connection between an outcome variable and a predictor variable. So if you look at educational attainment, so the number of years of education as a predictor variable, and then income at mid-career as an outcome variable, there are a number of possible mediators in between, such as gender, race and ethnicity, the physical location where you live, and so on. Moderators can influence how strong a relationship is between two variables, or it can change the direction of the relationship from positive to negative. And moderators, because they modify the nature of a relationship, they can sometimes make it more powerful, or it can weaken the relationship. And there are lots of possible ways that can happen in actual research findings. So for example, here, and again, I found this on Google Images, you have attitudes towards exercise. Like, I have very positive attitudes towards exercise. In general, you could find that there's a positive correlation between how positively you view exercise and how much you actually exercise. How much you actually exercise is going to be theoretically positively correlated with weight loss. How much you eat should be positively related to how much you work out. You can eat more when you work out more. And how much you eat, though, is negatively correlated with your weight loss. Now, let's say that people have pretty solid attitudes, but how much they exercise is still low. That means that attitudes towards exercise are not going to predict weight loss well. So I could have great attitudes towards exercise, but I'm not working out, maybe because I don't have access to equipment, or I don't like going to gyms because gyms, whatever. This variable remains low, amount of exercise, and weight loss isn't going to happen. What if I'm living in an area where my food intake is relatively controlled, and that means that I'm going to have this moderating impact of food intake. Maybe I'm surrounded by tons of food all the time, and I have lots of people who encourage me to eat way more than I might need or might otherwise eat. That may then nullify the impact of exercise and have a negative impact on weight loss. So just as an example, one of the things that path analysis allows you to do is kind of tease apart the impact of mediators and moderators as they relate to an outcome variable that you're trying to predict. So that concludes part 3 of chapter 5. We'll see you again with chapter 6.